There was nothing obviously wrong with their life, and that was exactly what made it unsettling. In the summer of 2022, in a quiet suburban community outside Denver, Colorado, the Carter family lived the kind of life most people would describe as stable, predictable, even enviable. Michael Carter worked as a systems engineer for a mid-sized tech company. His schedule rarely changed, his income was steady, and his approach to life followed a clear pattern. Identify problems early, solve them quietly, move on. His wife, Sarah Carter, worked part-time at a local public library, a job that allowed her to stay close to home and maintain a rhythm that revolved around their 7-year-old son, Jacob. Jacob was, in every practical sense, the center of the household. He had been with them for 4 years, since they had adopted him through the state system when he was 3. The transition had not been easy in the beginning, but over time, routines had formed, habits had settled, and what once felt uncertain had become something that resembled permanence. There were no major conflicts, no unresolved crises, no visible signs that anything was missing. And yet, Sarah could not ignore the persistent feeling that something was incomplete. It did not arrive as a clear thought. It never presented itself in a way that could be easily explained or dismissed. Instead, it lingered quietly, surfacing in moments when the house fell into silence, or when the day's responsibilities had been checked off one by one. It felt like an absence that had shape but no name, a presence defined only by what it was not. Michael did not notice it, or if he did not interpret it the same way. To him, the absence of problems was a sign that things were working. To Sarah, it began to feel like something else entirely, like a gap that had been carefully avoided rather than resolved. Weeks passed without the feeling fading. By late July, it had become impossible for her to ignore. The realization did not come all at once, but when it finally settled, it carried a quiet certainty that did not require validation. It was not based on logic alone, nor on any external pressure. It was closer to instinct, something that felt complete the moment it formed. Jacob should not grow up alone. That was the thought. Not dramatic, not urgent, but steady enough to change everything that came after. When she finally brought it up, the conversation did not unfold with tension or resistance. Michael listened the way he always did when he recognized that something mattered, even if he did not immediately understand why. He asked practical questions, considered the implications, and then, without needing to be convinced, agreed to explore the possibility. Once the decision was made, the process moved forward in a way that felt both structured and unpredictable. The U.S. foster and adoption system did not allow for quick outcomes. There were applications, background checks, financial disclosures, home evaluations, and multiple interviews with social workers whose role was not only to assess capability but to identify potential risk. Each step introduced new layers of scrutiny, new requirements, and new delays. Sarah approached each stage with calm consistency. Michael handled the logistical aspects with efficiency. Jacob was informed early, in simple terms, that another child might eventually join the family. He accepted the information without hesitation, though the depth of his understanding was difficult to measure. Time stretched. What began in late summer extended into the end of the year. By early 2023, the Carters had completed all preliminary requirements and were officially placed into the matching phase, a period defined less by action and more by waiting. It was during this phase that the call came. A child welfare coordinator from Kansas reached out with a potential match. A 6-year-old boy named Lucas had been in a residential care setting for several years. His file indicated no immediate behavioral risks, but it also noted a pattern of emotional restraint. He spoke when necessary, followed instructions, and rarely initiated interaction. There was one detail repeated multiple times in the report. He maintained a strong attachment to a single personal item, a braided blue cord tied around his right wrist. There was no documented origin for it. The Carters reviewed the file carefully. There was nothing in the information that stood out as unusual within the context of the system, and yet something about the profile aligned in a way that was difficult to ignore. The first visit was scheduled within 2 weeks. The facility was located in a rural part of Kansas, approximately 2 hours from the nearest major city. It housed a small number of children, each with different histories, different timelines, and different prospects for placement. Lucas was introduced without ceremony. He did not resist the meeting, but he did not engage in a way that suggested familiarity or comfort. His responses were minimal, his attention controlled, his reactions measured. He observed before responding, processed before reacting. There was no sign of fear, but there was also no sign of immediate trust. Jacob was present during the visit. The two boys existed in the same space without interacting directly. There was no conflict, no avoidance, but also no immediate connection. It was the kind of neutrality that could go either way over time. Sarah noticed something else. Not a specific action, not a visible behavior, but a subtle shift in awareness. Lucas paid attention to details most children ignored. He registered changes in tone, in pacing, in expectation. It was not caution. It was something closer to calculation. When asked about the cord on his wrist, the answer was consistent with the file. It had been with him when he arrived. There was no memory attached to it, only the certainty that it should not be removed. The visit ended without a definitive conclusion, but it did not feel incomplete. Over the next several weeks, additional visits were arranged. Sometimes both Michael and Sarah attended. Sometimes Jacob came along. The pattern remained consistent. Lucas did not open up quickly, but he also did not withdraw. He allowed proximity without offering access. And then, just as the process approached the point where a final decision would be required, new information surfaced. It did not come from the Carters. It came from the facility, and it would change the entire meaning of what they thought they were doing. The shift from possibility to commitment did not happen in a single moment, but once it began, it moved with a clarity that left little room for hesitation. By the time the first visit with Lucas ended, the Carters were no longer thinking in abstract terms. The idea of adoption had already taken shape months earlier, but now it had a name, a history, and a presence that could not be reduced to paperwork. What remained uncertain was not whether they wanted to move forward, but whether they were prepared for what that decision would demand in practice. The system did not allow emotion to lead. Every step required verification, documentation, and time. After the initial visit, the case moved into a more detailed review phase. Reports were updated, behavioral assessments were cross-checked, and the Carters were asked to provide additional information about their household routines, long-term plans, and capacity to support a second child with an unknown background. Sarah responded to each request with consistency. There was no visible shift in her approach, but internally, the earlier sense of absence had transformed into something more focused. It was no longer just a feeling that something was missing. It had become a direction. Michael, as expected, treated the process as a sequence of tasks that needed to be completed correctly and on time. He tracked deadlines, confirmed requirements, and maintained communication with the case coordinator in Kansas. Jacob's role in all of this was less defined but equally important. He had been told that another child might come into the family, and now that possibility had a specific form. Lucas was no longer an idea. He was someone they had met, someone who existed in a place that could be identified on a map, someone who might eventually share the same home. The visits continued. Each one followed a similar structure. Supervised interaction, observation, brief evaluations, and written summaries submitted afterward. Lucas remained consistent in his behavior. He did not resist the process, but he did not accelerate it either. His responses stayed measured, his engagement limited but stable. There were no sudden changes, no emotional swings, nothing that would complicate the evaluation from a clinical standpoint. That consistency mattered. In the context of the system, predictability was often interpreted as a positive indicator. It suggested stability, even if it did not guarantee connection. For the Carters, it created a different kind of tension. The absence of resistance made it easier to move forward, but it also made it harder to understand what Lucas was actually experiencing. Jacob's presence during some of the visits added another layer. There was still no direct bond between the two boys, but the initial distance had shifted into something more neutral. They occupied the same space without conflict. They shared activities without coordination. It was not closeness, but it was no longer separation either. It was a state that suggested potential, though not certainty. As the weeks passed, the case approached a critical stage. The agency began preparing for what was referred to as a pre-adoptive placement decision. This required final confirmation that both parties, the child and the prospective family, were suitable for a long-term arrangement. It also required one last comprehensive review of the child's background, including any details that might not have been considered relevant in earlier stages but could affect the final outcome. It was during this review that the first indication of missing information appeared. The coordinator in Kansas requested a delay. Not a rejection, not a complication, but a pause. The explanation was procedural. A secondary file linked to Lucas had been flagged during a routine database check. It contained information that had not been fully integrated into his primary case record. The discrepancy needed to be resolved before the placement could be finalized. For Michael, the explanation was straightforward. Systems occasionally produced inconsistencies. Records were sometimes incomplete. It was an administrative issue that would be corrected with time. For Sarah, it felt different. The timing was too precise. The process had been moving in a clear direction. And now, at the point where a decision was expected, something unknown had surfaced. It did not feel like a random delay. It felt like an interruption that carried weight, even if its meaning was not yet visible. The agency did not provide immediate details. They requested patience and assured the Carters that the issue was being reviewed internally. No further visits were scheduled during this period. Communication was reduced to brief updates, each one confirming that the case was still active but under additional evaluation. Time slowed again. Days passed without resolution. The structured rhythm that had defined the previous months was replaced by uncertainty. The Carters could not move forward, but they also could not step back. They remained in a position where the outcome depended entirely on information they did not have access to. Jacob noticed the change. He was not given the specifics, but the shift in routine was enough to signal that something had altered. The visits had stopped. The updates had become less frequent. The certainty that had been building now felt suspended. By the second week of the delay, the agency reached out with a request. They asked Sarah to schedule a direct conversation with the facility director in Kansas. The tone of the message was controlled, but it carried a level of urgency that had not been present before. This was no longer a procedural update. It was a disclosure. The meeting was arranged for the following afternoon. No additional details were provided in advance. No documents were sent. No summary was offered. The only information given was that the discussion would involve previously unavailable background data related to Lucas. When the call began, the structure of the conversation changed immediately. There was no introduction beyond what was necessary. No transition, no attempt to ease into the subject. The director moved directly to the point. Lucas had not entered the system alone. There had been another child, an older sibling. The separation had occurred several years earlier under circumstances that had been documented but not fully connected to Lucas's current file due to administrative fragmentation across state systems. The sibling had been placed in a different program, processed through a separate adoption track, and finalized shortly after. At the time, the connection between the two records had not been recognized. Now it had been. The director paused at that point, not to create tension, but to ensure clarity before continuing. The identity of the sibling had been confirmed, and that confirmation linked directly back to the Carter family. The confirmation did not arrive as a shock in the way people usually imagine. It did not break the moment into chaos or confusion. Instead, it settled with a weight that immediately reordered everything that had come before it. The name in the record matched exactly. There was no variation, no ambiguity, no room for interpretation. The older sibling listed in Lucas's file was Jacob Carter, the same child who had been living in their home for the past 4 years, the same child whose presence had shaped their routines, their decisions, their sense of stability. What had once been understood as a completed chapter was suddenly revealed as only half of a larger story. The agency did not present it as a coincidence. They framed it as a missed connection, a gap in a system that had processed two related cases independently without recognizing the link between them. Different states, different timelines, different caseworkers. The separation had not been intentional in the sense of neglect, but it had been final in practice. Until now. For Michael, the first response was not emotional. It was analytical. He needed to understand the sequence of events that had led to this point. How two children from the same biological background could be placed into separate systems without the connection being flagged. How records that should have been cross-referenced had remained isolated for years. The questions formed quickly, but the answers were limited. The system acknowledged the failure without fully explaining it. For Sarah, the impact moved in a different direction. The feeling that had been building over the past months, the sense that something was missing, no longer felt abstract. It had a clear source. It was no longer a question of whether their family was incomplete. It was a matter of understanding that it had always been incomplete in a way they could not have known. The timeline aligned with uncomfortable precision. Jacob had entered their lives 4 years earlier. Lucas had been placed into care at approximately the same time. The separation had occurred just before both children entered the system. The adoption had been finalized for Jacob quickly. Lucas's case had taken a different path, one that kept him within institutional care instead of moving into a permanent placement. The realization reframed every interaction that had taken place during the visits. The lack of immediate connection between the two boys no longer appeared neutral. It became something more complex. They had shared a beginning that neither of them could consciously remember, but that connection had not translated into familiarity. Instead, it existed beneath the surface, unrecognized but not entirely absent. Sarah began to revisit each detail she had observed. The way Lucas processed information before responding. The way Jacob adjusted his behavior without being asked. The subtle moments where their attention aligned without direct communication. None of it had seemed significant on its own. Now, it formed a pattern that was difficult to dismiss. The agency's position was clear. They needed to know whether the Carters intended to proceed with the adoption, now that the full context had been established. The situation had moved beyond a standard placement. It involved reuniting two siblings who had been separated for years. That introduced additional considerations, both legal and psychological. There was also a question of disclosure. Neither child had been informed of the connection. The agency recommended that any discussion be carefully timed and supported by professionals to minimize confusion or distress. The responsibility for that decision, however, would ultimately fall on the Carters if they chose to move forward. Michael and Sarah did not respond immediately. They ended the call with an agreement to review the information and provide an answer within the next 48 hours. It was a standard window for decisions of this kind, but the weight of it felt disproportionate to the time allowed. The house felt different after that conversation. Not in a visible way, not in a way that could be measured or explained externally, but in the internal structure of how everything was understood. Jacob was no longer just their son. He was part of a larger context that extended beyond their home, beyond their direct experience. Lucas was no longer just a potential addition. He was already connected to them in a way that had been hidden until now. The decision itself did not take as long as the agency expected. By the following morning, the conclusion had already formed. There was no scenario in which they would walk away. What had begun as an attempt to address a feeling of absence had become something entirely different. It was no longer about expanding their family. It was about restoring it to a state it should have had from the beginning. Jacob needed to be told. That part could not be delayed indefinitely. The agency had its recommendations, but the Carters understood their own household better than any external guideline. They knew how Jacob processed information, how he responded to change, how he handled uncertainty. Waiting too long would not protect him. It would only create a gap between what was true and what he was allowed to understand. The conversation was approached carefully, but not indirectly. Jacob was given the essential information without unnecessary detail. There was another child. That child had been identified as his biological brother. The connection had only recently been confirmed. The possibility existed for them to live in the same home. There was no visible resistance, no confusion that escalated into fear, no rejection of the idea, no hesitation that suggested doubt. The response was immediate in a way that did not require explanation. Acceptance, not because the situation was fully understood, but because it aligned with something that already made sense on a level that did not depend on explanation. For Sarah, that response confirmed what she had already begun to believe. The connection between the two boys had never been entirely absent. It had simply existed without a name. The agency was informed of their decision within the 48-hour window. The process resumed, but it was no longer the same process. It moved with a different level of urgency, a different set of priorities. Legal teams reviewed the case to ensure that no additional barriers existed. Social workers reassessed the placement with the new information in mind. Psychological consultants prepared recommendations for how to manage the transition. The final steps were defined by precision. Every document had to reflect the updated context. Every evaluation had to account for the sibling relationship. Every approval required confirmation that the placement would serve not only the needs of Lucas as an individual, but the dynamic between both children as a unit. The timeline accelerated. What had once taken months now moved within weeks. The next stage would not involve discovery. It would involve bringing Lucas into a home that, without anyone realizing it until now, had already been his. The information did not just change the direction of the process. It forced every assumption to be reconsidered. Until that moment, the Carters had approached Lucas as an individual case. A child with a past they did not fully know, entering a family that had already found its balance. The system had treated him the same way, isolated, evaluated, categorized based on his own record. But now the framework was no longer valid. Lucas was not separate. He was part of something that had already been integrated into their lives without anyone realizing it. The agency moved quickly once the connection was confirmed, but the speed did not reduce the complexity. If anything, it made each step more precise. This was no longer a standard adoption review. It was a correction of a separation that had lasted for years. Sarah and Michael were brought into a new series of evaluations, not to determine whether they could adopt, but to confirm whether reuniting the two boys would be stable over time. The language used by the professionals was careful. They did not assume that biological connection automatically meant emotional compatibility. They did not present reunion as inherently positive. Instead, they framed it as a transition that required structure, planning, and awareness of potential risk. Sarah understood that distinction immediately. What had felt instinctively right still needed to be handled correctly. The connection between Jacob and Lucas existed, but it had not developed naturally over time. It had been interrupted, and now it was being reintroduced under controlled conditions. That meant expectations had to be managed carefully. Michael focused on the procedural side. There were additional documents to sign, updated legal filings to reflect the sibling relationship, and coordination between state agencies that had previously operated independently. Colorado and Kansas had to align their records, confirm identity matches, and update case histories to ensure that nothing else had been overlooked. Every detail was reviewed again, this time with the understanding that the two cases were not separate. Jacob continued to process the information in his own way. There were no visible signs of confusion, but there was a shift in how he approached the situation. Lucas was no longer just someone who might join the family. He was someone who already belonged to it in a way that could not be undone. That distinction did not create pressure, created clarity. The agency recommended a structured disclosure plan for Lucas. Unlike Jacob, who had already been integrated into a stable environment for years, Lucas had spent most of his recent life in institutional care. His understanding of family, permanence, and identity was different. Introducing the concept of a biological sibling within the context of a new placement required timing. The Carters were advised not to reveal the full truth immediately. Instead, they were asked to continue the visits under the same framework, allowing Lucas to become more familiar with the household before adding a layer of information that could complicate the transition. The goal was not to hide the truth, but to introduce it at a moment when it would be received with stability rather than uncertainty. The visits resumed. This time, however, the context had changed completely for the Carters. Every interaction carried additional meaning. Every small detail was reinterpreted through the knowledge they now had. Lucas remained consistent. He did not become more expressive, but he did not withdraw either. His behavior stayed within the same controlled pattern. He responded when addressed, followed instructions, and maintained a level of awareness that suggested he was processing more than he revealed. Jacob's presence during these visits became more intentional. He was no longer just included as part of the family unit. He was central to the situation. The professionals observed not only how Lucas interacted with the adults, but how the two boys existed in relation to each other. There was still no immediate bond. No recognition that could be described as conscious. But there were moments that did not align with coincidence. Pauses in conversation that synchronized without coordination. Reactions that mirrored each other without direct influence. A pattern that suggested something underlying, even if it had not yet surfaced in a way either of them could identify. Sarah noticed these moments with increasing certainty. They were small, almost unremarkable if viewed in isolation. But together they formed a consistency that was difficult to ignore. It reinforced the idea that the connection between them had not been erased by separation. It had simply remained unacknowledged. As the process moved forward, the timeline tightened. The agency scheduled the final review meeting for early March 2023. By that point, all legal requirements had been addressed, all evaluations completed, and all records updated. The decision no longer depended on new information. It depended on confirming that nothing had been overlooked. The Carters attended the meeting with a level of clarity that had not been present at the beginning of the process. They were no longer evaluating whether they wanted to adopt Lucas. That decision had already been made. The question now was whether the system would allow the reunion to happen without further delay. The response came without hesitation. Approval was granted. The documentation reflected not only the adoption itself, but the formal recognition of the sibling relationship. From a legal standpoint, the two boys were now part of the same family unit in a way that was fully acknowledged and protected. The next step was placement. Lucas would transition into the Carter household within 3 weeks. The time frame was designed to allow for final preparations, both logistical and psychological. The agency provided guidelines for the transition period, outlining how to manage the first days, the first week, and the first month. One recommendation stood out clearly. The truth about the sibling connection should be disclosed soon after placement, but not immediately upon arrival. The initial priority was to establish stability, to allow Lucas to adjust to the new environment without introducing a concept that could disrupt that process. Sarah accepted the recommendation, but she also understood that timing would be critical. Waiting too long could create confusion. Acting too quickly could create pressure. The decision would need to be made based on observation, not instruction. As the placement date approached, the structure of their lives shifted again. This time, it was not defined by uncertainty. It was defined by preparation for something that had already been decided. What had begun as an attempt to fill an unexplainable absence had led them to a point where absence no longer existed. What remained was the responsibility of bringing everything into alignment with what had already been revealed. The moment the decision was finalized, everything that followed moved with a level of precision that left no room for hesitation. The paperwork was completed within the expected time frame. The legal confirmation arrived without delay. By the 3rd week after approval, the placement date was fixed. There were no remaining barriers, no pending reviews, no additional evaluations. From the system's perspective, the case had reached its conclusion. From the Carters' perspective, it was only the beginning of something they still did not fully understand. The days leading up to the placement were structured but quiet. There were guidelines to follow, recommendations to review, and a clear sequence of steps for the transition. The agency emphasized consistency above all else. The first days would define the baseline. Stability had to be established before anything else could be introduced. Sarah and Michael followed every instruction. They adjusted routines in advance, not by adding new elements, but by simplifying what already existed. They removed variables, reduced unpredictability, and ensured that the environment Lucas would enter was as steady as possible. Jacob was included in these preparations, not as an observer, but as part of the structure itself. His role was not defined in explicit terms, but it was clear that his presence would shape how the transition unfolded. Lucas arrived on schedule. There was no delay, no complication, no unexpected change. The transfer of responsibility was completed through the standard process. Documentation was signed, final confirmations were recorded, and the agency formally acknowledged that Lucas was now part of the Carter household. The first hours did not produce any dramatic shift. Lucas maintained the same behavioral pattern that had been observed during the visits. Controlled responses, minimal verbal engagement, consistent awareness of his surroundings. There was no resistance, but there was also no immediate sense of belonging. It was a state of observation, not participation. Jacob's behavior remained steady. He did not attempt to force interaction, nor did he withdraw. He maintained a consistent presence, allowing proximity without creating pressure. The absence of tension between the two boys continued, but it still did not translate into a recognizable bond. Sarah paid attention to the smallest details, not for signs of connection, but for signs of stability. The agency had been clear. The first stage was not about building relationships. It was about ensuring that the environment could support one. The first day passed without incident. The second day followed the same pattern. By the third day, the structure of the household had begun to include Lucas without disruption. He followed routines without resistance. He responded to expectations without hesitation. From an external perspective, the placement was successful. There were no warning signs, no behavioral concerns, no indicators that the transition was failing. But Sarah understood that success at this stage did not mean completion. The most important part of the process had not yet happened. The truth still had not been introduced. The agency's recommendation had been to wait until a baseline of stability was established. That baseline now existed. Waiting longer would not improve the situation. It would only delay something that needed to happen. The decision to speak was made at the end of the first week. There was no formal plan beyond clarity. No staged explanation. No attempt to control the reaction beyond ensuring that the information was accurate and complete. The goal was not to manage the outcome. It was to remove uncertainty. Jacob already knew. Lucas did not. The information was presented without unnecessary detail. There was another connection between them that had not been discussed before. It was not new, but it had only recently been confirmed. They were not just part of the same household. They were related in a way that existed before either of them entered the system. There was no immediate reaction that could be clearly defined. Lucas did not respond with confusion or rejection. He did not question the information in a way that required clarification. Instead, there was a pause that extended longer than any previous response he had given. Not hesitation, not resistance, but processing. Jacob's response was immediate. Not through words, but through certainty. The information did not introduce something new for him. It confirmed something that had already aligned internally. The absence of doubt in his reaction changed the dynamic of the moment. Sarah observed both responses carefully. The difference between them was expected. Jacob had been given time to process the information before the placement. Lucas was receiving it within a new environment, surrounded by changes that had not yet fully settled. The lack of a strong reaction was not a sign of indifference. It was a sign that the information had not yet fully integrated. Over the next days, subtle changes began to appear. Not in a way that could be isolated or measured directly, but in patterns that shifted slightly from what had been observed before. Lucas's attention toward Jacob became more consistent. Not forced, not deliberate, but present in a way that had not existed during the earlier visits. Jacob responded without altering his behavior dramatically. He maintained the same level of consistency, but the context had changed. The space between them no longer represented neutrality. It represented something that was beginning to form, even if neither of them could define it yet. Sarah recognized the transition for what it was. It was not a sudden connection. It was not an emotional breakthrough. It was the beginning of recognition without awareness, a process that would take time to become visible in a way that could be understood. The placement phase, as defined by the agency, had been completed successfully. From a procedural standpoint, the case was closed. But within the household, something far more complex had just started. The decision to bring Lucas into their home had been based on a belief that it was the right thing to do. The discovery of the sibling connection had transformed that belief into certainty. Now, the responsibility was no longer about making the right choice. It was about allowing that choice to become real. The first clear signs did not arrive as a moment of realization. They emerged gradually, embedded in patterns that repeated often enough to become impossible to ignore. At first, Sarah assumed she was projecting meaning onto ordinary behavior. The agency had warned her about that. When families expect connection, they often interpret coincidence as confirmation. She had taken that warning seriously. She had trained herself to observe without jumping to conclusions. But what she began to notice could not be dismissed as isolated incidents. It started with routine. Not the structure itself, but the way Lucas and Jacob moved through it. Meals, schedules, small daily expectations, none of these were new. Both boys had already adjusted to them in their own way. But there were moments when their responses aligned with a precision that had no obvious explanation. Not coordination, not imitation, but simultaneity. They approached the same tasks with identical timing. They paused at the same points. They adjusted without prompting in ways that mirrored each other without direct interaction. There was no communication guiding it, no visible signal, and yet the pattern repeated. Sarah did not point it out. She continued to observe, tracking consistency rather than reacting to individual moments. If it had happened once, it could have been coincidence. If it happened twice, it could have been chance. But it did not stop at two. Michael noticed it later. Unlike Sarah, he did not focus on subtle shifts. He paid attention when something became statistically unlikely. When the same pattern appeared across multiple situations, his interpretation changed. It was no longer about whether the behavior was unusual. It was about whether it could be explained by environment alone. He reached the same conclusion Sarah had already begun to accept. Could not. The similarities extended beyond routine. There were reactions that appeared under stress, though not in a dramatic sense. Unexpected changes in schedule, minor disruptions, small moments that required adjustment. In those moments, both boys responded in ways that were not only similar, but identical in structure. The timing of their reactions, the sequence in which they processed information, even the way they redirected their attention afterward, it followed the same pattern. None of it had been taught. Lucas had not spent enough time in the household to learn those responses from Jacob. Jacob had not been exposed to Lucas's environment long enough to adopt anything from him. The overlap existed independently of shared experience. Sarah began to understand the significance of that. This was not about developing a bond. It was about recognizing one that had never fully disappeared. The separation had interrupted their lives, but it had not erased the underlying structure that connected them. Lucas's behavior also began to shift, though in ways that remained controlled. His attention toward Jacob became more consistent. Not active engagement, not overt curiosity, but a steady awareness that did not fade. When Jacob moved through a task, Lucas registered it. When Jacob responded to something unexpected, Lucas tracked it. The distance between them still existed, but it was no longer neutral. It was defined. Jacob responded without changing his approach. He maintained the same level of consistency that had been present from the beginning. But there was a subtle difference in how he oriented himself within the household. His position relative to Lucas became more stable, less reactive, more integrated into the overall structure of their daily lives. Neither of them acknowledged what was happening. There were no questions, no attempts to define the connection. The agency had expected that understanding would take time, that it would require explanation and support. But what was developing did not depend on explanation. It existed beneath it. Sarah faced a different kind of tension. The truth had already been shared, but its meaning had not yet fully surfaced. Lucas knew the information. He understood the concept. But understanding a fact was not the same as integrating it into identity. That process could not be forced. The agency maintained regular check-ins during this period. They asked about adjustment, stability, behavioral changes. From a formal perspective, the placement was progressing successfully. There were no concerns that required intervention. The environment was stable. The child was adapting. The family structure remained intact. But the reports could not capture what Sarah was seeing. They could not quantify the alignment between the two boys. They could not measure the significance of small, repeated patterns that pointed to something deeper than adjustment. Those details did not fit into standard evaluation categories. Michael considered whether to report it. Not because it was a problem, but because it was unusual. In the end, he decided against it. The system was designed to identify risks, not to interpret connections that did not create instability. What they were observing did not require correction. It required time. By the second week after the disclosure, the patterns had become consistent enough to establish a baseline. Lucas no longer existed in the household as a separate element. He was integrated into the structure, not through overt connection, but through alignment. Jacob's presence was no longer something he adjusted to. It was something he operated alongside. Sarah recognized the shift clearly. This was no longer the early stage of placement. It was the beginning of something more permanent. Not a complete bond, not a fully formed relationship, but a foundation that did not need to be constructed from scratch. It had already been there. The separation had delayed its development, but it had not removed the possibility of it re-emerging in a way that did not depend on explanation. The agency had framed the process as reintegration. But what Sarah was witnessing felt different. It was not about building something new. It was about allowing something that had always existed to become visible again. By the third week after the disclosure, the situation reached a point where silence was no longer neutral. Up to that moment, the truth had been introduced, but it had not been fully absorbed. Lucas had been given the information that he and Jacob were connected, but that knowledge remained at the level of fact. It had not yet taken shape as something that influenced how he saw himself or how he positioned himself within the family. The patterns between the two boys had continued to develop, but without a conscious framework, they remained unspoken. Sarah understood that something needed to shift. The agency had emphasized gradual integration, but they had also made it clear that avoiding clarity for too long could create confusion. There was a point where information had to move from being acknowledged to being understood. That transition could not happen passively. She chose to address it directly, not by introducing new information, but by reinforcing what had already been said. The connection between Lucas and Jacob was not temporary. It was not conditional. It was not dependent on placement or circumstance. It existed independently of everything that had happened to separate them. That distinction mattered. Lucas's response did not change immediately. There was no visible reaction that suggested a sudden shift in understanding. His behavior remained controlled, his engagement measured. But the way he processed interactions began to adjust. Not in outward expression, but in the sequence of attention. He no longer treated Jacob as a separate variable within the household. He began to include him in the same category as the structure itself. Jacob's response remained consistent. He did not push for acknowledgement. He did not attempt to define the relationship in explicit terms. Instead, he maintained the same level of presence, allowing the dynamic to develop without interference. That consistency created a stable reference point, something Lucas could align with without pressure. The turning point did not arrive as a dramatic moment. It emerged through a small but definitive shift in behavior. During a routine interaction that had occurred many times before, Lucas did not pause in the same way he had previously. He did not process the situation as something external. He responded within it, as if the context no longer required evaluation. For Sarah, that difference was immediate. It meant that the connection had moved beyond recognition. It had begun to integrate. From that point forward, the patterns between the two boys changed in a way that was no longer subtle. The alignment that had previously appeared in isolated moments became consistent across different situations. Their responses were no longer just similar. They were synchronized in a way that suggested shared structure rather than parallel behavior. Michael noticed it clearly. The probability of coincidence had already been ruled out weeks earlier. Now, the consistency reached a level where it could not be explained without acknowledging a deeper link. The way they adapted to changes, the way they adjusted to expectations, even the way they navigated minor disruptions, it followed the same internal logic. There was still no verbal confirmation from either of them. No attempt to articulate what was happening. But the absence of that articulation no longer indicated uncertainty. It indicated that the connection did not require explanation to exist. Sarah made one more decision. She introduced a symbolic element that did not rely on explanation. It was not part of any recommendation from the agency. It was something she recognized as necessary based on what she had observed. Jacob had kept a small personal item since his early years in the household. It had no official significance, no documented history. It was simply something that had remained with him, something that represented continuity in a life that had once lacked it. Lucas had the cord on his wrist. That object had been constant from the moment he entered the system. It had no recorded origin, but it had never been removed. It was the only physical connection to a past he could not remember. Sarah did not assign meaning to these objects. She did not explain them. She did not frame them as symbols. She simply created a moment where both items were placed in the same space, without instruction, without expectation. The response was immediate. Jacob recognized the significance without needing it to be defined. Lucas did not hesitate. The two objects, which had existed separately for years, were now positioned together in a way that did not require explanation. That moment marked a shift that could not be reversed. The connection between them was no longer abstract. It was no longer something that existed beneath the surface. It had taken form in a way that both of them could recognize, even if they did not articulate it. Lucas's behavior changed after that. Not in a dramatic sense, not in a way that disrupted the structure of the household. But the restraint that had defined his interactions began to loosen. His responses became less calculated, less delayed. He no longer treated every interaction as something that required evaluation. Jacob's behavior adjusted as well. He did not change his approach entirely, but the consistency he had maintained now had a different quality. It was no longer about creating stability for Lucas. It was about sharing it. Sarah observed the transition with a level of clarity that removed any remaining doubt. The process had moved beyond adjustment. It had reached a point where the relationship between the two boys was no longer developing. It was functioning. The agency continued its standard follow-ups. From their perspective, the case remained stable. The placement had been successful. The child had adjusted. The family structure was intact. There were no indicators that required intervention. But what had happened within the household could not be captured in those reports. It was not a measurable outcome. It was the resolution of something that had been incomplete long before any of them were aware of it. And for the first time since the process began, there was no remaining question about whether the decision had been the right one. The answer had already taken shape. The final shift did not come from something new being introduced. It came from everything finally settling into place. By the time the fourth week passed, the structure of the household no longer required adjustment. What had once been carefully managed transitions had become ordinary continuity. Lucas no longer moved through the environment as someone adapting. He moved through it as someone who understood where he belonged within it. The distinction was subtle, but it changed everything. Sarah noticed it in the absence of effort. There were no longer moments where she had to anticipate reactions or prepare for uncertainty. The patterns that had once required observation now existed without attention. Lucas followed the same internal rhythm as the rest of the household, not because he had learned it, but because it aligned with something that had already been part of him. Jacob's presence within that structure had also shifted. He no longer functioned as a reference point for stability. He had become part of a shared system, one that did not depend on one adjusting to the other. The balance between them was no longer maintained. It existed naturally. The agency's final follow-up took place at the end of that period. From their perspective, the case had reached its conclusion. The placement had been successful. The child had adjusted. The family unit was stable. There were no outstanding concerns, no unresolved issues, no recommendations for further intervention. The file would be closed. Michael accepted that outcome without hesitation. From a procedural standpoint, everything had been completed correctly. The process had followed the required steps, the evaluations had confirmed stability, and the result aligned with what the system was designed to achieve. There was nothing left to manage. Sarah understood that the system had done its job. But she also understood that what had happened within their home extended beyond anything the system could measure. The feeling that had started everything was gone. Not because it had been replaced, but because it had been resolved. The absence she had sensed months earlier had not been imagined. It had been real, even if she had not known what it was at the time. It had been the result of something incomplete, something that existed beyond her awareness but still affected her. Now, that absence no longer existed. It had been filled not by adding something new, but by restoring something that had always been there. The decision to take the boys to the coast came without discussion. It was not planned as a significant event. It was not framed as a milestone. It was simply the next step, something that fit naturally within the rhythm that had been established. For Lucas, it was the first time encountering something entirely unfamiliar. But the reaction was not defined by novelty. It was defined by recognition, in a way that did not depend on memory. There was no confusion, no hesitation, no sense of distance from the experience. It was accepted immediately, as if it had always been part of his world. Jacob's response mirrored that acceptance. There was no distinction between the two of them in that moment. No indication that one was experiencing something for the first time while the other was not. The difference in their histories did not create separation. It disappeared within the shared experience. Sarah watched them carefully, not for confirmation, not for reassurance, but because she understood that this moment represented something that could not be repeated. It was not about where they were or what they were doing. It was about what no longer existed between them. The separation that had defined their early lives was gone. Not erased, not forgotten, but no longer active. On the drive back, the quiet that settled over the car carried a different meaning than it had months earlier. Before, silence had been something Sarah associated with absence. It had been where the feeling of something missing became most noticeable. Now it was something else entirely. It was complete not because everything had been said, but because nothing needed to be. The two boys sat in the back, not as individuals navigating the same space, but as parts of the same structure. There was no visible effort to maintain that connection. It did not require attention. It did not require reinforcement. It existed on its own. Michael drove without needing to interpret the moment. For him, the outcome was clear in the same way any solved problem was clear. The variables had been identified, the missing element had been located, and the system had been corrected. There was nothing left to question. But Sarah understood that it was not a problem that had been solved. It was something that had been restored. There is a difference between creating something and recognizing that it was already there, waiting to be found. What they had done was not build a family. They had uncovered one. And sometimes the most important connections in life are not the ones we choose or the ones we create, but the ones that exist long before we understand them, quietly waiting until the moment we are ready to see them, and strong enough to remain even after everything else has changed. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to today's story. It truly means more than words can express that you stayed with us from beginning to end. In a world that moves so quickly, where attention is often divided, your presence here is something we deeply appreciate. This story is not just about a family or about adoption or even about coincidence. At its core, it is about connection, the kind that cannot be explained by logic alone. Sometimes, the things we feel but cannot name are not random at all. They are quiet signals, guiding us towards something real, something unfinished, something that belongs to us in ways we don't yet understand. And when we choose to listen to those feelings, even when they don't make immediate sense, we open the door to moments that can change everything. The journey in this story reminds us that not all bonds are created over time. Some are already there, waiting to be rediscovered. Life may separate people, delay them, or place them on completely different paths. But what truly belongs together has a way of finding its way back. Not through force, not through perfect timing, but through something deeper, something that remains even when everything else changes. If this story touched you in any way, if it made you pause, reflect, or feel something meaningful, we would love to hear your thoughts. Please take a moment to leave a comment below and share what stood out to you the most. Your perspective matters, and it helps create a space where more stories like this can continue to be told. And if you'd like to support our channel, it's simple. Just like the video, leave your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. Your support allows us to keep bringing you stories that inspire, that connect, and that remind us of what truly matters. Thank you again for being here with us today.